Last week's video covered magnesium deficiency, the pattern of yellow leaves with green veins that shows up first on the oldest, lowest leaves of a plant. A number of comments came in describing almost the identical pattern, green veins against yellow tissue, but appearing in exactly the opposite location. New growth at the top of the plant, pale and yellowing, while the older leaves further down stayed perfectly green. That is not magnesium deficiency showing up differently. That is a completely different problem with a completely different fix, and it deserves its own full explanation, because the cause is almost never what most gardeners assume. Here is the detail that surprises nearly everyone the first time they hear it. The vast majority of garden soil in the United States is not actually short on iron. Most soil contains far more total iron than any vegetable plant could use in a lifetime. The problem is almost never scarcity. The problem is access. Iron in soil exists primarily in a form called ferric iron, written chemically as ferric oxide, the same iron compound responsible for rust. That form of iron is essentially insoluble. It will not dissolve into soil water in any meaningful quantity, which means plant roots, which can only absorb dissolved minerals carried in soil moisture, cannot take it up no matter how much of it sits in the surrounding dirt. For iron to become available to a root, it has to be converted into a different chemical form, ferrous iron, which is soluble and absorbable. And that conversion depends almost entirely on one factor: soil pH. This is the single piece of information that determines whether this entire video applies to a particular garden. So it is worth walking through carefully before touching any remedy. At a soil pH below roughly 6.5, the conversion from insoluble ferric iron to absorbable ferrous iron happens readily, and iron deficiency is comparatively rare. Above a pH of about 7.0, that conversion slows dramatically, and above 7.5, it becomes severely restricted. In alkaline soil, a plant can be standing in dirt that is, by total mineral content, iron-rich, while its roots are functionally starving because the iron present is locked in a chemical form the plant has no way to access. This explains something that confuses a lot of home gardeners. Adding more iron to already alkaline soil through a generic all-purpose fertilizer or a handful of iron-rich compost frequently does almost nothing, because the new iron immediately converts to the same insoluble ferric form as everything else already in the ground. The fix is not more iron. The fix is iron in a form the plant can actually absorb despite the soil's pH, or addressing the pH itself. Here is how to confirm this is actually the problem before doing anything else, because an accurate diagnosis here takes 30 seconds and saves an entire wasted treatment cycle. Look specifically at the newest leaves at the growing tips of the plant, not the older leaves further down the stem. Iron is classified as an immobile nutrient inside a plant, meaning that, unlike magnesium or nitrogen, the plant cannot pull iron out of older tissue and relocate it to new growth when supply runs short. Whatever iron a new leaf gets, it has to absorb fresh from the soil at the moment that leaf is forming. This produces a diagnostic signature that is the mirror image of magnesium deficiency. The newest growth at the top of the plant shows the interveinal yellowing first and most severely, pale, almost bleached-looking tissue between distinctly green veins, sometimes progressing to nearly white in severe cases. The older, established leaves lower on the plant typically remain a normal, healthy green because they absorbed their iron earlier, before the lockout became severe enough to matter. New growth pale, old growth green, iron. Old growth pale, new growth green, magnesium. That single distinction is the fastest, most reliable field diagnosis available without a soil test. A simple soil pH test using an inexpensive probe or a basic test kit available at any garden center confirms the underlying cause within minutes. A reading above 7.0 alongside the new growth chlorosis pattern essentially confirms pH-induced iron lockout as the mechanism at work. Now the complete method, step by step, starting with the fastest and most direct fix and moving to the longer-term correction. The fastest correction is chelated iron, applied as a foliar spray directly to the affected leaves. The word chelated describes a specific chemical structure in which the iron ion is bound inside an organic molecule that protects it from converting back into the insoluble ferric form, even in alkaline conditions. This is the critical difference between chelated iron products and plain iron supplements or rusty metal scraps. Chelated iron remains absorbable regardless of soil pH because the plant absorbs the whole chelated complex rather than relying on the soil chemistry to deliver free iron ions. Mix chelated iron according to the product's label rate, typically 1 to 2 teaspoons per gallon of water for most home garden formulations, into a spray bottle or pump sprayer. Apply directly to the affected new growth, covering both the top and underside of the leaves thoroughly, since absorption through leaf tissue, called foliar uptake, happens through stomata located primarily on the leaf underside. Apply in the early morning or the last hour before sunset, never in direct midday sun, since UV exposure degrades the chelated compound and intense heat can cause the spray to evaporate before absorption occurs. A single foliar application typically produces visible improvement in new growth within 3 to 5 days, since the plant is absorbing usable iron directly through the leaf surface rather than waiting on a slower root zone correction. This is the step most gardening advice skips entirely, and it is the step that actually solves the underlying problem rather than just patching the symptom. Foliar spraying treats the leaves currently growing. It does nothing to fix the soil chemistry that caused the lockout in the first place, which means new growth will keep showing the same deficiency indefinitely unless the root zone pH problem gets addressed directly. For soil correction, elemental sulfur is the standard, well-documented method for gradually lowering soil pH into a range where iron becomes more naturally available. Apply granular elemental sulfur at a rate based on a current soil test, typically in the range of 1 to 2 pounds per 100 square feet for a moderate pH reduction, worked into the top several inches of soil around the affected plants. This is not a fast process. Soil bacteria convert elemental sulfur into sulfuric acid gradually, and the resulting pH shift typically takes several months to fully develop, often most of a growing season for a meaningful, lasting change. This is why the two-part approach matters. Foliar chelated iron for an immediate, visible fix on current growth, paired with elemental sulfur worked into the soil for the long-term correction that prevents the problem from recurring every season. There is a household alternative worth mentioning, both for what it offers and for its real limitations, because online gardening advice substantially overstates what it accomplishes. Soaking rusty iron objects, nails, and old iron skillet scraps, horseshoe pieces, in a container of water mixed with a small amount of vinegar for 1 to 2 weeks does produce a mildly iron-enriched liquid. The acetic acid in the vinegar reacts with the rust, ferric oxide, on the surface of the metal, converting a small amount of it into soluble ferrous and ferric acetate compounds that do enter the water. This method genuinely works as a very slow, low-concentration iron source, and gardening traditions going back generations have used some version of it. The honest limitation is that the quantity of bioavailable iron produced this way is modest compared to a properly formulated chelated iron product. And the iron released through this method is not chelated, meaning that once it is applied to alkaline soil, it remains vulnerable to converting back into the insoluble ferric form relatively quickly, the same lockout problem the whole video started with.
For a gardener who wants to try this approach, it works best as a supplementary practice, applied regularly over a season to soil that is only mildly alkaline, rather than as a primary fix for a plant showing severe chlorosis in strongly alkaline soil. For more significant deficiency, chelated iron remains the more reliable, faster, and ultimately more cost-effective solution, despite its slightly higher upfront cost, because it actually solves the problem instead of providing a small, temporary supplement that fights an uphill chemical battle. Here are the 3 mistakes that cause this particular fix to fail for a meaningful number of gardeners attempting it for the first time. The first mistake is treating plain, non-chelated iron supplements as a substitute for the chelated form in alkaline soil. A generic iron sulfate product, while cheaper, converts to the same unusable ferric form within days in soil with a pH above 7.0, essentially wasting the application.
If a soil test confirms alkaline conditions, chelated iron is not an optional upgrade. It is the only form of supplemental iron that will reliably reach the plant. The second mistake is expecting a single foliar application to solve a recurring seasonal problem permanently. Foliar iron treats the symptom on existing growth. Without the parallel soil pH correction using elemental sulfur, or without consistent, repeated foliar applications throughout the season, the next round of new growth will show the identical deficiency, because the underlying soil chemistry never changed. The third mistake, and this one catches even careful gardeners off guard, is over-applying elemental sulfur in an attempt to speed up the pH correction. Soil pH changes driven by sulfur conversion happen on a bacterial timeline that cannot be meaningfully accelerated by adding more product. Excessive sulfur application can overshoot the target pH, push soil into a range too acidic for the plants actually growing there, and create an entirely new deficiency problem on the opposite end of the pH spectrum. Follow label rates based on an actual soil test, apply once per season, and allow the gradual timeline to play out rather than reapplying out of impatience. Blueberries, azaleas, rhododendrons, and roses are the plants most frequently and most visibly affected by this specific deficiency, largely because all of them have root systems adapted to acidic native soil conditions and struggle disproportionately the moment garden soil drifts into neutral or alkaline territory, which happens easily near concrete foundations, walkways, and driveways, since lime leaching out of cured concrete steadily raises the pH of adjacent soil over years. A rose bush or blueberry planted within several feet of a concrete walkway is meaningfully more likely to show this exact pattern than the same plant positioned further from any concrete structure, a detail worth checking before assuming the deficiency originates purely from native soil chemistry. For anyone looking at new growth right now that is pale, yellow, and veined, while the older leaves below stay healthy and green, the diagnosis is specific enough to act on immediately. Test the soil pH. If it reads above 7.0, the lockout mechanism described in this video is almost certainly the cause. Apply chelated iron as a foliar spray for a visible response within days. Work elemental sulfur into the root zone based on an actual soil test reading for the long-term fix that prevents this from recurring every single season. And if there is a concrete walkway, foundation, or driveway near the affected plant, that detail is worth noting because it is very likely part of the explanation. If this kind of precise, step-by-step gardening method is what brought you to Rooted Grace, the like button and the subscribe bell keep this work going every week. Drop a comment below with your plant's exact pattern, which leaves are affected, and whether there's any concrete nearby, and I will help you work through whether this is the deficiency in play. The next video in this series moves away from leaf color entirely and into a problem just as common and just as commonly misdiagnosed. Blossom drop. When a plant covered in yellow flowers produces almost no fruit at all. That one is coming next week. Until then, check the new growth first, test the pH before treating, and remember that more iron is rarely the answer when access, not scarcity, is the actual problem.